Now we're going to go ahead and start the installation on this 392 HEMI Jeep JL. Now, this happens to be a 22. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and show you how to do the install here. What we're going to do is, first of all, we're going to remove this factory skid plate system they have here, which includes this bar going across, this center section up to the cross member, and this one in the front going across. We're going to use a 13mm socket here on the two at the fuel tank, and we're going to go ahead and use an 18mm here on the others. We're going to go ahead and remove the nuts here first. Then we're going to go ahead and use an 18mm socket and remove the outer ones. Now we are going to keep the hardware as we're going to reuse these nuts here. Now that the factory cross members and skid areas are out of the way, we can go ahead and start the installation of our Rock Hard 4x4 Bellypan complete skid system. What we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to bring the Bellypan up here in place. We're going to grab one of the black 14mm bolts. We're going to go ahead and thread it in here in the center as we hold the plate up. Well, let's go ahead and do that next. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and, now that we've installed this center bolt, we're going to go ahead and install these two with our Rock Dome tapered washers on it. Now that we've went ahead and installed these three bolts, and you'll notice that we've left them really loose, we're going to go ahead and get the rear cross member and go ahead and put it in place. Now we've went ahead and set the rear cross member in place. This is the one that has the machined areas for these nuts. What we're going to go ahead and do is we've lined it up on the outside to make sure our bolts are straight, and we're going to go ahead and snug these and tighten them up here. These are the only bolts you're going to tighten before you go further. We are using the factory nuts with a 13mm socket. Now we're going to go ahead and take the smaller of the carriage bolts, one of the washers and a lock nut, and go ahead and put it in the rear cross member here. And what we're going to do is we're only going to start the nut maybe 1 or 2 turns. Now we're going to go ahead and go to the front cross member. Now we're going to go ahead and take the front cross member and set it in place. Do it so that the holes here line up where the oil pan is going to go. Now we're going to go ahead and put the outer corner bolts in. We're going to use the black bolts again on the 3 with the large tapered washer. There's a spacer that goes and such on the right, on the passenger side rear, and we'll address that in a second. Once again, we're leaving all hardware loose, especially around the outer corners of the belly pan, as we address and put the other skid plates in place. Then we're going to bring everything up nice and slowly, evenly throughout the whole belly pan system. Now this particular belly pan system we're installing is an aluminum shield, so that means the plates are aluminum, but all of our bracketry, all of our cross members are steel, and that's how we gain the strength. Just for guys that are wanting a little bit lighter weight system, we offer it in the aluminum. This particular 392 style also has the cutout here to allow for the lowered exhaust. Now we're going to go ahead and do this right rear. As we talked about, it's a little bit different. It takes the 8.8 style of grade bolt metric and one of the spacers and one of the tapered washers. What you're going to do is you're going to put the bolt through, put the spacer in between the cross member and this pan, and go ahead and bring it up and start that bolt. Make sure that we leave loose here, as we're going to be pushing the skid plates in between here on the certain applications. Now, one of the things on these 392 HEMI builds is the exhaust is fairly expensive, and it's not something you want to tear up. So what we've went ahead and done is we've went ahead and built a skid plate to cover up this H section of the exhaust. We're going to go ahead and install this skid plate by putting it into the nuts into the frame that are factory here, using our bolts that we supply with, again, the tapered washers. So you're going to bring this skid plate up in place. Okay, now that we've went ahead and started the one bolt on the frame, we're going to go ahead and start the other one. Now with those two installed, we're going to go ahead and put the one here going up through the cross member and the one here going up through the cross member. Of the 3 carriage bolts that are part of this install, you're going to be using the 2 larger ones, as the smaller one goes right here in this area. Once again, leaving all hardware loose. Now we're going to go ahead and install this bracket here that goes from the skid plate on up to this factory cross member in the frame. Okay, we're going to grab the bracket 90527-D. This is the exhaust support bracket on the 392. You're going to go ahead and grab the bolt, the metric bolt, where it's going to go into the frame here. So we're going to go ahead and start that on the top. We're going to go ahead and bring the bracket around like this. Take that 3/8 bolt and that lock nut and go ahead and install this bracket here. Now with this installed and all hardware loose, we're going to go ahead and do the fuel tank skid. Now we're going to go ahead and install the fuel tank skid on this 392 HEMI JL. We're going to take a 18mm socket and we're going to remove these 2 factory bolts here on the outside of the frame rail. Now you'll notice in our skid plate that we do mount to those factory bolts. So we've supplied bolts, but we can also just reuse the factory hardware also in this location. Now that you've removed those 2 bolts, go ahead and grab your skid plate. Bring it up in place and reinstall the bolts. Now you'll notice that on the skid plate on the fuel tank side, it goes in between the cross member and the belly pan. Yes, when we tighten it down, there'd be a slight gap here, but it squishes it in place, makes it so it cannot move. The other thing is, notice that the resonator skid actually goes on top of the cross member on this side. Now we're going to use our 18mm socket again right here on this cross member. We're going to go ahead and remove this bolt here. You're going to grab bracket 90501C as in Charlie. Now this bracket is designed to go with the 90-degree bend at the top. As I said, you can use our hardware that we supply, or you can reuse the factory bolts if you want to. On this particular bracket, I actually put the bolt coming from the inside by the fuel tank going towards the center of the car, towards the drive shaft. It just made it easier to hold it in place. We're going to go ahead and snug the top bolt, but leave the bottom one loose yet. Now there's a little bit of tightness left to go on that, but I wanted it so that I could go ahead and put the rear brackets in place. There's going to be one on the inside and one on the outside. We're going to do the one on the inside next. We're going to use that 18mm and remove the back corner bolt to the fuel tank to the rear cross member above the rear axle. Now we're going to go ahead and use the bracket that has 2 90-degree bends with a twist in it. It's a 90501B as in boy bracket. As I said, you can reuse our hardware, or you can use the factory hardware. The skinnier part of the bracket goes towards the frame. Now on this rear bracket here, we had a little bit of trouble because as we went and took this loose, this twisted a little bit on us because there's just some pressure from it from the factory of not fitting perfectly. And that's just part of having so many different components that bolt together. So what we did is we actually just put a pry bar in here and we pried from up in here and just twisted it back a little bit. Now I went ahead and used one of our supplied bolts and washers, as the washer is just slightly narrower and gives a little bit more room on that upper bolt. Just kind of a little tech tip that works when you run into that problem. Now we're going to go ahead and take another bolt here on the bottom and go ahead and bolt the lower bracket up. Now that we've got this one in place, we're going to go ahead and do the outer one here on this rear corner. Okay, now we're going to use an 18mm socket. Remove this outer bolt here on the frame to install the last of the rear brackets. This is a 90501A bracket. Now we've went ahead and installed the rear bracket on this outside here with the 3/8 bolt and nut, along with the 3/8 bolt and nut on this side bracket in the rear. We did use our rock hard 4x4 supplied bolt at the frame. We use the factory bolts on this side and our other brackets here using the 3/8 hardware and the factory bolt at the frame. The cross member is installed in the back. Everything's loose on the belly pan skid. Now we're going to go ahead and go to the front to our oil pan skid system. Now, I want to talk about the cross member and where the oil pan comes into play. The cross member, and then you have our actual skid for the belly pan. Now, the oil pan skid is the last piece to go on because it goes over the top of, it goes on the bottom side, we should say, of this main belly pan system. The threads that are in the center of this cross member right here are 1/2 inch. So you're going to use the standard 1/2 inch threads, bolts that we send to you, and the tapered washers. Then you're going to go ahead and grab your oil pan and go ahead and put that in place. Okay, now that we've installed the 1/2 inch bolt with the tapered washer on this side, leaving all hardware loose, we're going to go ahead and install the other side. Now we're going to go ahead and talk about the front brackets. Now you have a passenger side bracket and a driver's side bracket. Now, what we're talking about is actually where the motor mount comes to the frame. On the Jeep 392 here, you have a single post on the back of each side. Those are the ones we're going to be mounting off of. Now, these thread extenders are basically a long nut with a threaded insert of a stud. What we're going to do is we're going to install these on the threads themselves. We'll tighten them down and then go ahead and install the brackets. We're going to go ahead and put those in place. We're going to go ahead and now take a deep socket and tighten it. We're going to go ahead and thread that in place over the stud. Use a 17mm socket and tighten it down. Go ahead and repeat the process on the other side. Now we're going to go ahead and grab the 90527 bracket, 90527F bracket, and go ahead and install that on the driver's side. We're also going to use the 10mm by 150 nut on the top side, and go ahead and use the 1/2 inch bolt with nylon lock nut on the bottom side at the bracket to the skid plate. The bracket on this goes on the inside of the skid plate. Now we're going to go ahead and grab this other bracket for the passenger side. This is a 90527E as in Edward. We're going to go ahead and install it on the stud up above and then down here at the skid. Okay, now that we've went ahead and installed the nut, we've left it loose so we can pry the bracket around to get it in place. We're going to go ahead and put the bolt through the bracket and then through our skid plate and install the 1/2 inch nut on the outside. We've installed the 1/2 inch bolts here at the oil pan skid on each bracket. We've made sure that we've got adequate clearance. We've installed the 1/2 inch bolts here at the cross member with the tapered washers. The 3 here in the center, the 4 out at the corners, using the longer bolt here on the passenger side with the long spacer. We've installed the 1/2 inch carriage bolt here and here, the 3/8 carriage bolt here with the nut and washer on top of this one, and the nuts on top of both of these. We've used the factory bolts in the areas we can on the outside of the fuel tank skid. We've went ahead and used the supplied bolts from Rock Hard 4x4 here at the outer edge, along with tapered washers. At each of the brackets, we've used the 3/8 bolts with the nylock nuts, and we've used either the factory bolts at the frame, or we've used the bolts supplied by Rock Hard 4x4. Now that we've went ahead and we've got everything installed, all brackets, all hardware, we've went over everything, everything looks really good. Now we're going to go ahead and start snugging things up. The most important thing is we're going to start with the actual cross member on each side and the belly pan system. So this is going to be done with these outer bolts here on each side. We're going to be doing that with a 19mm socket along with the 3 here in the center. We're going to bring the outer edge up and the center at the same time, doing a little bit of a turn at each area. Now we're using 2 9/16 wrenches and go ahead and tighten in all the brackets where they meet the skid plates. Now we have had some customers ask, what about driveline clearance? Normal standard drive lines clear without any issue. There is some guys that'll do some really crazy suspensions that have a lot of dropout. Or if you're running like the 1350 shafts, you just want to make sure you have adequate clearance to the actual skid plate here. If you need to, there's plenty of strength. You can open that up a little bit if you feel you need to on your particular install. Oh, but that's only going to be needed if you have aftermarket drive shafts and or aftermarket rear ends. Now that we have the 9/16 in our hands, we're going to go ahead and tighten this carriage bolt up here. Now we're going to go ahead and grab a 3/4 and tighten this one here and this one here, along with all of our brackets on our oil pan skid. Now we're using a wrench on the inside, 3/4, and a 3/4 socket here on the outside. We're going to go ahead and tighten these brackets down on each side. Now, since we still have our 3/4, we're going to go ahead and tighten these two bolts at the front cross member and the oil pan. Now, the only other bolts we want to do is we want to check and make sure our oil pan door is tight, and then we need to tighten the two bolts at the nuts at the motor mounts. This is snugged in place using a 13 or 1/2 inch socket. Now I'm tightening the nuts on the motor mount bolts using a 17 millimeter socket.